What is vulnerability? Well, if you look up the definition in a dictionary, you'll see that it says the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Some of the synonyms are helpless, weakness, defenseless, powerless. We think of someone being vulnerable when they're in a threatening or potentially harmful situation or in a weak position. With a definition like that, it's no wonder that so many people think of vulnerability as only a weakness, but vulnerability is also a strength. It takes courage to show yourself to the world without all of your armor. You're potentially opening yourself up to attacks, criticism, judgment, or whatever. And also, being vulnerable is how you build authentic connections. If you aren't letting someone see your true self, then they're not really in relationship with you. They're in relationship with who you are pretending to be. And there is so much freedom in just being who you are.
When we first talked about recording on the topic of vulnerability, we talked about the fact that it is a strength as well as sometimes a weakness. And I think it's hard to wrap your brain around the idea that it can be both at once. But I think the fact that we're talking about these things separately, I think it gives us an opportunity to really shine a light on the importance of vulnerability as a strength. Because I think everybody knows how it can be a weakness when you're, especially as a caregiver, you're caring for someone who maybe is in a vulnerable state, but shining a light on the strength of it and how if you can't be honest and open with at least the people in your close circle, they can't help you in the ways that you might need. You need to be able to have an authentic relationship with your support system. And that requires vulnerability on your part. You need to be able to express your fears. You need to be able to express where you maybe feel like you're not measuring up.
Vulnerability is something that Lance and I had a hard time with when he first became sick, because it does require a pretty high level of trust, I think. And because we weren't sure what we wanted to share and who we wanted to share with, it did make it hard for us to get help. So that's a good point, that it was something that we had to really practice, being vulnerable so that we could get the help that we needed.
From what you've told me, you and Lance had a pretty close relationship with each other. So I'm assuming that there was a pretty high level of honesty and vulnerability with one another, which I thought when you've talked to me about that probably served you guys very well. And it was one of the things that carried you along throughout your relationship. So I'm guessing that because you had that as a baseline between the two of you, that gave you kind of a framework or something to go off of when you were maybe encountering other people that you weren't sure whether or not you could trust them or whether or not you could let them into your inner circle. So that was very fortunate that you guys had that baseline.
Well, we had that baseline with each other. When we met, we both had the attitude of, this is me, take it or leave it. And we just put everything out there. And if the other one didn't like it, then that was just our clue that it was time to move on. And that's how we started our relationship. And we just carried that all the way through. But we also had been hurt in our lives before we met each other. And so there was a wall of protection that we had. So that vulnerability that we had was just for the two of us. It wasn't something that we were really willing to share with the rest of the world. So it took us a while to practice that and just to figure out how to do that, how to be vulnerable with other people.
Do you think that it was kind of a natural bent for the two of you, or was it something you had to learn prior to meeting one another? Um, I've often wondered that, and I don't think I've ever asked you. Was it something that you had practiced prior to meeting one another? Did it just happen naturally? How did you guys come to a space where you were able to um, engage in a relationship that was that open and trusting?
Um, that's something that I I don't really know how it happened. It just happened. It was that was just something that I had with Lance. That was something that Lance had with me. And I think it was just such a gift that we met when we did, that we were at the point in our lives that we were at where we were just done with the games and we were not going to put up with anything from anyone. And that's how we started out with each other. So I think that just allowed us to be vulnerable with each other. Neither one of us had ever really been that vulnerable with people in our lives prior to that. So I don't know. That was truly a gift.
It was because you had met your soulmate.
I would agree with that.
In thinking about being vulnerable, I wonder like what does it take to increase the vulnerability in your own life in a positive way? And I think one of those really important things is being willing to step out of your comfort zone to do something maybe that you've never done, to try something that you've never tried, or even in a more practical way to just challenge the parts of yourself that you're not super thrilled with, to say this is a quality that I don't love about myself and it maybe isn't so great on my relationships and I want to change that. That's vulnerability.
Yes. And I think adding to that, being willing to be open and honest, starting with being open and honest with yourself, because how often are we not even honest with ourselves? So being vulnerable requires that too. And also, this one was really important for me, accepting that you are not in control of how others respond to you.
I remember when I was in a rough space in my life, and a woman told me that she had learned a response to people's maybe negativity or criticism where she would say, I don't receive that. And I thought that was really important because people respond sometimes with like a pile of garbage and they hand it to you. You have a choice of whether or not you accept that from them and take it. So people can say all kinds of things, but we don't have to accept it. We don't have to take it. We can just say, no, thank you. Let them keep it over there. We can't control what they say, but we can control whether or not we accept that into ourselves.
Right. And it's not something that you have to say out loud to them, but you can say it to yourself that you're not going to accept that. You're not going to receive that.
I think it's very powerful. And I think it helps us grow and realize our own ability to kind of dictate how we view ourselves.
Well, I will say that learning to be vulnerable was not easy. It was very hard for me to do that outside of being vulnerable with Lance. So, um, and it's because you're left feeling exposed, um, fearing rejection or judgment, and just wondering what will people say if they know the truth. Being vulnerable leaves you open to all kinds of responses, but the way that I turned that around was it also weeded out people that were not meant to be in my life. So I did use that as a tool to try and determine who was really supposed to be there at that time.
I've heard it said that if you give people a chance and you just listen, they'll tell you exactly who they are. And I think that's true. The more that I've been willing to open myself up to criticism or rejection, the more aware I am of how often people really do tell you exactly who they are. And they give you everything you need to know about whether or not you want to move forward into a relationship with them or back off. Because sometimes I think I'm just going to step back a little bit because I am not going there. So I think that's a really important point. Just making sure that everyone that's in your life is who should be there. And I think vulnerability kind of helps facilitate that process.
Yeah. And we found it being vulnerable by asking for help. And we really found the people who were meant to be in our life at that time based on how they responded. And it was a very vulnerable thing to do, to ask for help. And I found a lot of times that I feared asking for help because of that. Another way was sharing my emotions or our emotions when I was caring for Lance. That's another way that that can be challenging. Admitting your mistakes. Um, I'm going through this list of things and I'm thinking how hard this has been my whole life, but these are all things, these are all ways to build more authentic relationships. And it has all served me well. It's not an easy practice, but it's all been so good, especially as I move forward in my life, because I feel like the the connections that I have with people now are more authentic than they've ever been, because I am willing to be more vulnerable and I'm willing to be open and honest about whatever I'm going through.
I would say I agree with that. And in my own life, I think one of the hardest things for me was not to admit when I'm wrong, but to admit when I don't know something. So just kind of revealing where I'm most insecure. So I want to have all the answers all the time. And when I don't have an answer, my tendency would be to just make something up, not necessarily to lie, but to try and provide an answer when asked. So that was probably one of the biggest keys to my own development in this area, was just learning to say, I don't know. I don't have an answer. I can't help you with that. It was really hard for me, but practicing it um, has been better and it's improved it. And now I'm I'm much more comfortable. It's still not great, but I'm much more comfortable saying, I don't know. I can't answer that question for you. And I think I think it encourages people to be able to say the same thing for themselves, right? When they see, oh, somebody else doesn't know the answer, it's okay that I don't know the answer. And so I think it gives people space to go like, oh, okay, they have the same thing that I do, or they struggle in the same areas that I do. So I think that's probably been one of my biggest growth areas, is just not having an answer.
I would agree with that being encouraging. And I also find that when somebody says, I don't know, I instantly have more respect for that person. That's a very vulnerable thing to say. You're right. Well, thanks for joining me, Jenna, and I will see you next time.
Bye.